am 76 years old, and for the last 6 winters I have lived alone in a 2-story wooden house on the edge of a small town in Minnesota, a place that seems to freeze harder and longer with every passing year, though perhaps it is only me who feels the cold more sharply now. Once this house was alive with voices, with the smell of soup simmering on the stove, with the sound of my wife humming in the kitchen and the patter of our daughter's feet running across the hallway floor. But all of that has gone silent, leaving behind an emptiness that I try to fill with routine, as though the daily repetition of small acts might hold the world together for just a little longer. I wake up early because sleep no longer comforts me, and I sit by the window wrapped in a heavy sweater, waiting for the sun that so rarely shows itself in these northern skies during winter. Sometimes I boil water and make coffee, though I never get the taste quite right, and then I carry the mug into the living room and watch the world outside stiffen under ice, the branches bending low as if they too have grown old. The house, once a prideful investment and a proof of my ability to provide, has become a constant reminder of my fragility. Every corner whispers of the years that have passed. Every wall holds the photographs of people who are gone or who have drifted far away. My wife, Linda, died 9 years ago, and since then I've felt as if I have been trying to carry an invisible weight that no one else can see but that presses on me every hour of every day. I keep her things where they were, not out of superstition, but because I cannot bear to erase the last traces of her presence. Her scarf still hangs on the back of the chair in the hallway. Her favorite blue teacup sits untouched on the shelf. Her voice, I sometimes think, lingers in the walls, like the echo of a song that refuses to fade. Our daughter, Emily, does not understand why I hold on to these relics. She says that it is unhealthy, that I should clear the space, move into a smaller apartment, or perhaps even into a retirement home where there are people around me, where someone would notice if I did not get up one morning. But I cannot leave. This house, with all its loneliness, is still mine, and in it I can still pretend, if only for brief moments, that Linda might walk down the stairs again, smiling the way she used to, holding a plate of toast, telling me that I had overslept. Emily is my only child, and I suppose in some ways she is all I have left in this world. She lives only a half-hour drive away, but she comes by regularly, always in a hurry, always with her phone in hand, answering messages from work or consulting with her husband about some arrangement or bill. When she does visit, her presence fills the rooms with a kind of nervous energy rather than warmth. She is polite, sometimes even kind in a mechanical way, asking if I am taking my medication, if I remembered to refill the prescription, if I need anything from the grocery store, but she no longer asks about my feelings, nor does she sit down to talk the way we once did. I understand, of course, that she has her own life, that she is burdened with responsibilities I can barely imagine, and yet something in her tone has changed over the years. There is a distance, a calculation, as though she has begun to see me not as a father, but as an obligation to be managed, a task to be crossed off the list. I try not to judge her harshly, because I remember how devoted she once was. When she was a child, she would climb onto my lap with a book and insist that I read to her, even when I was tired from work, and her laughter then was the brightest sound in the house. She was sensitive, imaginative, easily wounded but also easily delighted, and Linda often said she was too gentle for the world. Somewhere along the way, perhaps in the grind of building her career, in the endless rush of deadlines and payments and household struggles, that gentleness hardened into something else. Now when she looks at me, I sometimes feel as though she is calculating how much longer I will remain in this house. How much longer before the burdensome bills, the endless maintenance, and the sheer cost of my survival will finally stop weighing on. Her shoulders. I do not want to think this way about my daughter, and yet the thought creeps in unbidden during long nights when the wind rattles the windows and the furnace groans with the strain of keeping me warm. The winters here are merciless. They stretch for months, beginning with the first snow in November and lasting often until late March. Temperatures drop so low that the air itself feels like knives against the skin, and every gust of wind carries a warning. My joints ache, my breath fogs instantly, and I wrap myself in layers of clothing even inside the house. But still, the chill settles in my bones. Each month, the heating bill arrives, like a reminder that life has become a transaction between me and the gas company. And every time I open the envelope, I feel the sting of numbers rising higher and higher, as if even survival is demanding a price I am less able to pay. I can afford it, for now, because I saved carefully during my working years, but I know that Emily looks at those bills with a different eye. To her, they are not just costs. They are wasted money, unnecessary spending on a house that she believes I should already have left behind. I sometimes wonder if she wishes me gone. It is an awful thought, one I would never dare to voice aloud, but it lingers in the back of my mind whenever I catch her glancing at the photographs of the house, or asking questions about whether I've considered selling. When she speaks of the future, it is not my future she envisions, but hers, a future where she and her husband are free from the responsibility of checking on me, where perhaps this house becomes theirs to sell or keep as they wish. I do not blame her entirely. Perhaps in her place I would feel the same fatigue, the same impatience. But the sting of being seen as a burden by the very child whose birth once gave my life new meaning is sharper than any winter wind. Most days I live quietly, keeping myself occupied with tasks that are small but steady. I shovel the path when snow piles high, though it takes me longer than it once did. I fix loose handles and oil squeaking doors. I read old books, their pages yellowed but familiar, and sometimes I listen to music on the radio, letting the melodies carry me back to evenings when Linda and I danced slowly in the living room, not caring if anyone saw us. I try to remain dignified, to maintain the sense that I am not helpless, that I can manage my affairs even as age presses on me with its silent insistence. Yet I know how quickly perceptions can shift, how easily an adult child can turn a father into a patient, a responsibility, a burden. This is where my story begins. In a house that creaks under the weight of snow, with bills that pile on the kitchen table like quiet accusations, with a daughter who visits not out of love but out of duty, and with me, an old man holding on to dignity, holding on to memory, holding on to the thin thread of independence that winter after winter becomes more fragile. I do not seek pity, only understanding, for this is the shape of my life now, the stage on which the rest of the story will unfold. It happened on one of those evenings when the air outside was sharp with frost and the windows rattled against the gusts, a night when the furnace worked so hard I feared it might finally give up and leave me to freeze. Emily had come by unannounced, her visits always unpredictable, sometimes cheerful, sometimes critical, and always brief, as though she could not bear to stay longer than duty required. That night she arrived with her husband, Robert, a man who had grown distant and dismissive of me over the years, though we once shared polite conversations about work and life. He carried himself with a kind of efficiency that makes people seem cold, always checking his watch, always eager to move on, and he followed Emily into the kitchen where I had prepared a simple supper of stew and bread. I remember how awkwardly we sat together at the table, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of spoons against bowls, until Emily began to complain softly about the heating bill I had left on the counter. She picked it up as though it were evidence of some crime, scanning the numbers with a tight-lipped expression, and then she sighed in that way of hers that signals disapproval. She asked me how I could justify spending so much just to heat a house that was far too large for one old man, and I told her gently that survival in this climate had never been cheap, that the house was old and drafty, and the winters longer than they used to be. She did not answer directly, but I could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she thought about numbers not in terms of my comfort, but in terms of cost, as though each dollar spent on warmth was another dollar subtracted from whatever she imagined might someday be hers. When I stepped out of the room for a moment to fetch more bread, I heard it. My ears are not what they once were, but in the stillness of the hallway their voices carried clearly enough. Emily leaned close to Robert and whispered, "He won't last the winter." The words pierced me with a cruelty sharper than any frost. They were not said with sorrow or worry, not with the tone of a daughter fearing for her father's health, but with a quiet certainty, an acceptance, almost a relief. It was as though she had already drawn a line under my life, already made peace with my death, already begun to imagine the world without me in it. Robert did not argue, did not comfort her, did not say that she was wrong. He simply nodded, as though the statement was so obvious it required no response. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding against my ribs, my hands trembling as I held the bread. I wanted to step back into the kitchen, confront them, demand an explanation, but something inside me told me to remain still, to swallow the moment in silence. I returned to the table, pretending I had heard nothing, but the words echoed in my head like a bell that would not stop ringing. "He won't last the winter." Over and over I heard it, and with each repetition it grew heavier, filling me with a mixture of despair and defiance. I tried to study Emily's face as we finished supper. She smiled faintly when I offered her more stew, thanked me politely when I handed her the bread, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it, if my eyes had deceived me. But then I saw the way she avoided my eyes, the way her fingers tightened around the folded heating bill she still held in her hand, and I knew that I had not misheard. She truly believed I would not live to see spring, and worse, she was not grieving that belief, but calculating around it. In that instant, a crack formed in the fragile bond that still tied me to her, a crack that would widen with every passing day. After they left that evening, I sat in the living room with the bill spread out on my knees. My name was printed clearly at the top, the letters bold and undeniable. It was mine, this bill, this responsibility, this cost of survival, and it was my signature that would pay it, not hers, not Robert's. I stared at that piece of paper as if it were a declaration of my existence, proof that I was still here, still capable, still alive. To her, it was nothing more than wasted money, but to me, it was a record of resilience, of standing against the cold, of refusing to give in. In the days that followed, I began to notice things I had ignored before. Emily's calls, when they came, were not about how I was feeling or whether I was lonely, but about whether I had considered signing certain papers, whether I had looked into assisted living facilities, whether I thought keeping the house was practical. She never used the word burden, but it hung unspoken between every syllable. When she visited again a week later, she walked through the house with a critical eye, touching the railing of the stairs, the peeling paint near the window, the worn carpet in the hallway, as though cataloguing its flaws not for repair but for appraisal. She did not see the memories embedded in these walls, the laughter that had once echoed here, the love that had filled these rooms. She saw only a property, something to be measured, valued, sold. And all the while, those words haunted me. He won't last the winter. Sometimes at night I would wake in the dark, convinced I had heard them whispered again, and I would sit up in bed, my chest tight, until I realized it was only memory repeating itself. Yet the effect was the same. I began to sense that my life was not simply slipping quietly toward its natural end, but being counted down by those who should have cherished it most. That single whisper had changed everything. It had turned each of Emily's visits into inspections, each of her questions into veiled demands, each silence into a confirmation of her impatience. I wanted to believe she was simply tired, that Robert's influence had hardened her, that beneath it all, the girl who once clutched my hand and begged me to tell her bedtime stories still existed. But doubt gnawed at me, and I could not shake the feeling that my daughter, my only child, had already buried me in her mind. It was on one such visit, not long after that night, that she tried again to persuade me to consider a retirement home. She said it with the same rehearsed patience, speaking slowly as though to someone incapable of understanding, and when I resisted, she frowned and reminded me of the costs of heating, the danger of living alone, the risk of falls, the endless responsibilities of maintaining the house. I let her speak, and when she finished, I reached to the counter, picked up the latest heating bill, and slid it across the table to her. "My name," I said quietly, "is on that line. As long as it is, I will manage." She stared at the paper for a long moment, her lips tightening, and then she placed it back on the table without a word. In her eyes I saw not relief or respect, but a flicker of irritation, as if my refusal to surrender was an inconvenience to her plans. That was the catalyst. That was the moment I knew something had shifted beyond repair, that the daughter I had loved and raised was no longer looking at me with the eyes of family, but with the eyes of someone who had already weighed the cost of my existence and found it too high. The winter had only just begun, but in her mind it was already the season of endings, and I understood then that my fight was not only against the cold outside, but against the quiet betrayal within my own blood. After that evening, when I slid the heating bill across the table, and she returned it with that small, irritated frown, the air between us began to shift in ways that were at once subtle and undeniable, like the first cracks spreading silently across ice before the whole lake gives way. Emily's visits grew more frequent, but they carried none of the warmth of reconciliation. Instead, they resembled inspections, carefully timed checkups where she walked slowly from room to room with her phone in her hand, taking notes or discreetly, snapping photographs of corners where paint had chipped or where water stains had marked the ceiling. She explained none of it to me, and when I asked, she brushed it aside, saying she was only trying to help me keep track of the maintenance. But I knew from the cautious way she angled her phone that these were not pictures meant to guide repairs. They were records, evidence for some argument she was constructing in her mind, the case file of a daughter preparing to prove that her father was no longer capable of managing his own life. At first I told myself I was imagining things, that grief and loneliness had made me suspicious, but then small humiliations began to appear, each one like a pebble dropped into a jar, insignificant on its own, but adding weight until the jar could no longer be lifted. One Saturday, she arrived with 2 cardboard boxes and announced she was going to help me declutter. Without asking permission, she carried them upstairs and began emptying the closet where Linda's winter coat still hung. I stood at the doorway as she folded them briskly, not even pausing to smell the faint trace of perfume that still lingered in the wool. And when I protested, she said sharply that I had to be practical, that these coats were out of style, that they only collected dust. I told her that they were not coats, but memories, pieces of a life I had shared with my wife. But she kept folding, saying she would take them with her, donate them perhaps, or maybe keep 1 or 2 for sentimental value. The phrase stung me, because I could see no sentiment in the mechanical way she stripped the closet bare. On another visit, she brought along a folder of papers and tried, in her calm, rehearsed voice, to persuade me that it was time to establish power of attorney. She said it as though it were a kindness, something that would make my life easier, a way to take the burden off my shoulders. I asked her what burden she was referring to, and she gestured vaguely around the kitchen at the stack of utility bills, the bottles of pills neatly lined on the counter, the dented kettle humming on the stove, as though these ordinary signs of daily life were proof of incapacity. She told me I should sign so that she and Robert could handle the finances if I became ill. I looked at her for a long time, trying to find the little girl who once slipped her hand into mine at the grocery store and asked me to buy her candy, but all I saw was a woman hiding impatience behind a mask of reason. I refused, of course, and she sighed and tapped the papers back into the folder, her disappointment barely concealed. Each week it seemed she returned with another argument, another small erosion of my dignity. She reminded me of neighbors who had slipped on the ice and broken hips, as though my bones were already brittle glass. She asked if I had thought about what would happen if I forgot to turn off the stove, implying that flames would soon devour the house because I had left a kettle to boil. Once, when I invited her to stay for dinner, she quietly told Robert in the hallway that she didn't trust my cooking anymore, that perhaps it would be better if they picked something up on the way home. I heard every word, though she thought I could not. It was in moments like those that I felt the sharp sting of humiliation, the sense of being transformed from father to child, from man to burden, from figure of respect to object of pity and impatience. The most painful wound came when I overheard her speaking to Robert about the house itself. They stood in the living room one evening while I lingered in the hallway, unnoticed, and Emily ran her hand across the mantel where Linda's photographs still stood. She said the property could fetch a good price even in the winter market, that with some renovations it might cover the debts Robert was facing from his latest business venture. Robert nodded approvingly, saying that maintaining such an old place was wasteful, and together they spoke about the house not as the home where Emily had grown up, not as the sanctuary where Linda and I had poured our years of labor and love, but as a financial asset, a line on a balance sheet waiting to be liquidated. I felt my knees weaken beneath me, not from age, but from betrayal, for it was clear then that their plans had already moved beyond whispers of my death into calculations of what to do once I was gone. And yet, despite the hurt, I could not sever the bond. Each time Emily left, I stood at the window watching her drive away, my heart aching with the memory of the child she once was, the daughter who used to run barefoot across the lawn in summer, chasing fireflies and calling for me to catch them with. That child still lived in my memory, and it was that memory which kept me silent, which made me swallow the indignities rather than confront her with the bitterness gathering in my chest. But the silence came at a cost, because each unspoken word added to the weight pressing against my heart, and each act of quiet endurance made me seem weaker in her eyes. The escalation was not in grand gestures, but in these small daily erosions. The coats carried away, the folder of papers pushed across the table, the photographs taken without explanation, the whispered conversations about my future conducted as though I were already absent. They believed I did not notice that age had dulled my perception, but I saw more clearly than ever before. I saw that I was being treated as a man already half gone, a man whose presence was tolerated only until his absence could be turned into profit. One evening, after they had gone, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the heating bill again, my name still bold at the top. I traced the letters with my finger and thought about how much power a simple name can hold, how much of life is bound up in the right to claim one's existence on a page. As long as my name stood there, I was not gone. I was not incapable. I was not the burden they imagined. I was the one who kept the furnace running, who shoveled the path, who managed the house. I was the one who remembered Linda's laughter, who carried the memory of Emily as a child, who bore the weight of years with dignity. And though they whispered and plotted, though they gathered evidence and folded coats into boxes, though they measured my life against the cost of gas and electricity, I was still here, but the pressure was building, and I knew it could not remain hidden much longer. Something was coming, a confrontation inevitable as the snow that kept falling outside, layering the ground deeper each day, heavy enough to bend even the strongest branches. The first escalation had already begun, and with it the fragile peace between father and daughter was cracking, preparing to give way to something harsher, something I dreaded, yet knew I could not avoid. It was in the deep of January, when the snow lay heavy against the window sills and the nights seemed longer than the days, that the tension between us finally broke the surface and revealed itself in plain words, no longer disguised by polite tones or rehearsed arguments. Emily arrived one evening carrying not groceries or small talk, but a stiff leather folder, the kind of thing lawyers use when presenting contracts, and she set it down on the table between us with a firmness that left no doubt about her intentions. I had been sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, the radio humming faintly in the background, and when she placed the folder in front of me, I felt the air shift, as if the walls themselves had drawn tighter around us. She began to speak with the careful cadence of someone who has rehearsed every phrase, telling me again about the dangers of living alone, about the burden of bills, about how complicated matters would become if I fell ill or worse. Her words were wrapped in concern, but her eyes betrayed a different urgency, a hunger disguised as care, and as she slid the papers toward me, she said all I needed to do was sign, that it would make everything easier, that I would not have to worry about money or decisions, because she and Robert would handle it all. I picked up the first sheet and read the words slowly, though my eyesight is no longer sharp. It was not assistance she was offering, but authority. The papers would grant her power over my finances, over my house, over the very decisions that keep a person a person. If I signed, I would cease to be master of my own life, reduced instead to a dependent waiting for permission to spend my own savings or to remain in my own home. I looked at her across the table and saw not the daughter I raised, but a woman who had come to see me as an obstacle, and I felt both anger and sorrow rising in equal measure. She urged me again, her voice low, almost pleading, telling me that I was being stubborn, that it was for my safety, that I should trust her. I listened in silence, then set the papers aside, reached for the most recent heating bill that still lay unopened on the counter, and placed it before her. My name stood at the top, clear and undeniable. I tapped the line with my finger and said, "As long as that name is here, I will manage." The look she gave me then is burned into my memory. It was not the look of a daughter confronted with the resilience of her father. It was the look of someone whose carefully constructed plan had been delayed by an inconvenient refusal. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes cold with irritation, and though she said nothing, I knew in that moment that my refusal had shifted something between us. She gathered the papers with a snap, tucked them back into the folder, and told me in a voice tight with frustration that I was making things harder than they needed to be, that I was being unreasonable, that I would regret it when the time came. Then she stood, collected her coat, and left the house without another word. I sat at the table long after the sound of her car faded, the heating bill still in front of me, my finger resting on my name as though it were a lifeline. In that moment, I understood with painful clarity that this was no longer about care or worry or even family. It was about control, about ownership, about the silent war between my will to live on my own terms and her desire to manage what I had built. That realization changed me. Until then, I had endured the humiliations quietly, swallowing the bitterness in order to preserve some semblance of peace, but now I knew the fight could not be avoided. She had shown her hand, and in doing so, she had forced me to choose whether to yield or to stand. That night I did not sleep. I walked the house instead, moving from room to room as if to reassure myself that it was still mine, touching the worn banister, the framed photographs, the books lined neatly on their shelves. I thought of Linda, of what she would have said if she had seen her daughter trying to take authority over my life before I was even gone. I could almost hear her voice urging me not to give in, reminding me that dignity once surrendered is rarely regained. By dawn I had resolved that no matter how cold the winter grew, no matter how heavy the bills became, I would hold on to this house and to my name for as long as breath remained in me. The confrontation with Emily marked a turning point, not just in our relationship but in my own perception of myself. For years I had allowed age to soften my defiance, had told myself it was easier to remain quiet than to stir conflict. But now I felt a clarity I had not known in a long time. I was not helpless, I was not forgotten, I was not yet gone. And if my daughter had begun to count down the days to my absence, I would count each one as proof that I was still here, still capable, still unwilling to hand over the last pieces of my independence. It was, in its way, the moment the story shifted from silence to battle, from endurance to resistance. The winter outside pressed harder, the snow piled higher, the wind rattled louder, but inside I found a resolve as steady as the furnace's hum. The midpoint had come, and from here there would be no turning back. The weeks after that confrontation unfolded with a strange heaviness, as if the house itself had absorbed the tension and now carried it in every creak of the floorboards and every groan of the furnace. Emily no longer pretended that her visits were casuals or motivated by affection. Each arrival was purposeful, calculated, and accompanied by Robert more often than not. They would appear on weekends, sometimes without calling in advance, and walk through the house with the air of inspectors rather than family. They asked fewer questions about my health and more about the state of the property, whether the roof had been repaired after last year's storm, whether the insurance was current, whether I had considered how difficult it would be to sell in winter. Their voices carried the tone of people speaking not to me but about me, as though I were present only in body, while decisions about my future were already being made elsewhere. One Saturday afternoon, Robert produced a folder of his own, thick with printouts and charts. He explained in the clipped language of an engineer that the costs of maintaining the house were unsustainable, that a smaller property would be more practical, that my savings would last longer if I downsized. He spoke as though he were doing me a favor, presenting evidence in a case I had never agreed to hear. I listened politely, though my blood simmered, and when he finished, I asked him if he had calculated the cost of dignity, if he had a chart for the value of memory, for the price of walking through the rooms where my wife's laughter once lived. He stared at me blankly, uncomprehending, and Emily quickly intervened, telling me not to be difficult, telling me that Robert was only trying to help. Her voice trembled slightly with irritation, and I saw in her eyes the same flicker I had seen when I refused to sign the papers, the anger of a person whose plans were being delayed by resistance. It was around that time that the bank sent me a letter which chilled me more than the January wind. The envelope contained a notice that a request had been made for joint access to one of my accounts, a request that bore Emily's name. I had never given permission for such a request, never even been consulted, and yet here was the evidence that she was moving behind my back, attempting to establish a legal foothold into my finances. I called the bank immediately, my voice trembling not from weakness but from fury, and demanded that no changes be made without my direct authorization. The clerk on the line apologized, assured me that nothing had been processed, and promised to flag the account for extra security. Still, the damage was done. My daughter had tried to reach into my life not with care, but with grasping hands, and the betrayal stung so deeply that I spent that night pacing the house, my fists clenched, whispering aloud to Linda's memory that I would not let them take what was ours. Emily must have sensed that her attempt had failed, because her visits grew sharper in tone. She began to bring up stories of other elderly relatives or acquaintances who had slipped into confusion, who had burned food on the stove or wandered outside without coats, who had signed away their assets without realizing it. Each anecdote was delivered with a meaningful glance, a warning disguised as concern, but I understood the strategy. She was building a narrative, laying the groundwork for a claim that I was no longer capable of managing my affairs. It was subtle at first, but then she grew bolder. One evening, while we sat in the living room, she looked directly at me and said, "Dad, you've been forgetting things more often lately, haven't you?" I stared at her, stunned because it was not true, and when I denied it, she smiled thinly and replied, "You might not notice it yourself." That's how it begins. The implication was clear. She was preparing to cast me as a man already slipping away, even while I sat before her sharp-minded and furious. The cruelest blow came when she brought Robert into the conversation and asked him, in front of me, whether he remembered the night I'd nearly set the kitchen on fire. Robert nodded solemnly, playing his part, though no such incident had ever occurred. They were inventing memories, planting false stories, weaving a net of lies to trap me in an image of incompetence. I tried to argue, tried to tell them it was untrue, but the more I protested, the calmer they appeared, and in their calmness I recognized the tactic. They wanted to make my anger look like confusion, my resistance like the flailing of a man no longer in control of his mind. It was then that I understood they were not only willing to betray me, but to distort reality itself in order to justify their betrayal. I began to notice that some of my belongings were out of place. A drawer left slightly open when I knew I had closed it. Papers shuffled in my desk, though I had not touched them. One evening I discovered that my passport, which I kept in the top drawer of the bedroom dresser, had been moved beneath a stack of old letters. I had not placed it there. A week later, my checkbook disappeared for 2 days before reappearing in the kitchen drawer where I never keep it. At first I wondered if I was imagining it, if perhaps fatigue had clouded my memory, but the pattern was too consistent, too precise. Someone was going through my things, and I did not need to ask who. Emily had a key, and Robert was always at her side. They were searching for documents, gathering evidence, perhaps even hoping to misplace something crucial so they could later claim I'd lost it myself. The escalation reached its most brutal form when Emily finally said aloud what she had whispered months before. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands folded neatly, her eyes steady, and she said, "Dad, you're not going to make it through another winter like this." She said it without malice, without visible cruelty, as though it were a simple fact, like predicting the weather, but the cold certainty in her voice shook me to my core. I asked her what she meant, and she replied that the cold, the isolation, the bills, the strain, they would be too much for me, and that it was time to accept that reality. She said it was not about her, not about Robert, but about my safety, and yet every word was threaded with the quiet assumption that I was already defeated. I looked at her then, really looked, and I realized with a heaviness that stole the breath from my lungs that my daughter was gone. The girl who once begged me to hold her hand while she learned to ride her bike. The young woman who cried on my shoulder after her first heartbreak. The person I had believed would carry forward the best of Linda and me. She was no longer there. In her place sat a stranger who wore my daughter's face but spoke with a voice of calculation. A woman who had already consigned me to death in her mind, and who now worked methodically to shape the world around that expectation. That night after she left, I sat by the window watching the snow fall in heavy sheets, each flake illuminated briefly by the yellow glow of the street lamp before disappearing into the darkness. I felt an ache deeper than loneliness, deeper than betrayal. It was the ache of being erased while still alive. They were trying to write me out of my own story, to turn me into a helpless figure who needed to be guided, managed, silenced. And I knew then that if I did not act, if I did not hold firm, they would succeed. The second escalation was not a single blow, but a series of relentless strikes. The false stories, the stolen documents, the whispered predictions, the attempted intrusion into my finances. Each was designed to weaken me, to convince the world and perhaps even myself that I was fading. But I was not fading. I was furious, I was wounded, and above all, I was still alive. The battle had moved from hints and whispers into open confrontation, and though my hands shook as I held the heating bill once more, my resolve grew steadier than ever. I woke before dawn to the hush that only comes in the hardest cold, that hollow quiet where even the furnace seems to hold its breath between cycles, and I decided I would stop waiting for someone else to choose the path of my life because waiting had become another way of surrendering. I boiled water, poured coffee that tasted of resolve more than flavor, put the latest bills in a neat stack with the heating charge on top, folded my scarf the way Linda used to fold it for me, and drove into town through air that glittered with frost until the courthouse clock rose up out of the pale morning like a metronome for whatever courage I had left. At the bank, I asked to see the manager and placed in front of her the letter about the attempted access request, along with my driver's license and the passbook I still keep out of habit, and I told her as steadily as I could that my accounts were not to be touched by anyone but me, that every phone number and email on file should be replaced with the ones I'd written in careful block letters, that any signature which did not shake with my particular tremor should be considered a forgery. She listened, nodded, made copies, added a second authentication step that would ring the landline on my kitchen wall, and when I asked for a printed record of the request bearing Emily's name, she slid me the page without a fuss, and in that small gesture I felt something firm up inside me, the sense that paper and ink could still stand between a man and those who would take what is his. From there I walked 2 blocks through air so brittle it squeaked in my lungs to a law office that had once prepared our will when Linda was still alive and we believed the future could be planned like a garden. And I sat across from a woman named Benton who wore a gray sweater and the kind of expression that makes people tell the truth. And I told her everything from the whisper in my kitchen to the moved passport to the invented fire I had never set, and when I finished she did not flinch or offer pity. She simply took out a legal pad and said we would erect a wall higher than whispers could climb. She proposed an irrevocable trust that would hold the house and the savings with a neutral corporate trustee, not a relative, not a friend, no one who could be leaned on in a hallway. And she said we would pair it with clear medical powers that appointed my long-time physician and the trustee, not Emily, to make decisions only if 3 independent assessments ever agreed my mind had dimmed beyond consent. And then she slid across the desk a template letter revoking all prior permissions, rescinding keys and forbidding entry without express invitation, and said that if they ignored it, the police would call it trespass, not family discord. I asked whether I was too late, whether such steps would seem vindictive, and she shook her head and said that boundaries are a kind of love for oneself, and that sometimes love must be notarized to be believed. I spent the rest of the day making the kind of preparations people assume old men forget. Not because I wanted a fight, but because I had learned that the only way to survive a winter is to seal the drafts before the wind finds them. At the clinic, Ty requested a cognitive assessment. Not the sort of 5-minute quiz that can be twisted into a headline, but a thorough evaluation with clock drawings and memory lists and a neurologist who has no reason to curry favor with anyone. And while appointments usually crawl, a cancellation had opened and they took me that afternoon. And I sat there answering questions with the stubborn precision of a man counting his own breaths. And when I left, with the preliminary letter stating in tidy language that my memory and judgment were intact for my age, I felt the strange buoyancy that comes not from triumph, but from clear lines on the paper. I phoned an HVAC company and asked for an inspection, and a young man with raw hands climbed into the crawl space and pronounced the furnace safe, the filters clean, the heat consistent, then typed it all into a report with his name and license number, and I paid him with a pen that did not shake and filed the report behind the bank letter and the doctor's note, a growing stack that felt almost like armor. I knew the confrontation had to be mine. Not a surprise sprung on me in my own hallway, so I invited Emily and Robert to supper as if we were trying for a truce, and then I invited 2 other people without explanation. Pastor Green, who buried Linda, and knows what it means when a man says enough, and Mrs. Patel from next door, whose porch light has been a lighthouse for my winter walks and whose eyes miss very little. I set the table neatly and warmed a stew that needed more time than I had left, placed the heating bill at my seat as if it were a guest of honor, and slid the folder from Benton under my chair so I could feel its corner against my shoe like a talisman. They arrived with that brisk smell of car heat and impatience, Robert unlacing his boots as if he were giving me a gift by not tracking snow on the rug, Emily kissing my cheek without meeting my eyes, and when they saw the pastor and Mrs. Patel. They looked at each other the way people do when they realize the conversation they planned will have witnesses, and I could almost hear the quick adjustments spinning behind their faces. We ate in the uneasy rhythm of people pretending to be ordinary, and I asked after their week and Robert's project in the plant in Emily's foyer that never seems to thrive, and only when the dishes were pushed aside did I bring the heating bill onto the bare wood and lay my palm on my name. I said that not long ago Emily had whispered a sentence in this kitchen that had been burrowing into me like cold under a door, and that while I understood fatigue and fear and even the math she recited about costs, I could not swallow the certainty with which she had declared me as good as gone, and I told her that in the time between that whisper and this supper I had added up my own columns and made my own plan. I slid the bank letter forward and let the pastor read it first. Then Mrs. Patel, and I watched Robert's jaw tighten as his name was not there to share the blame, and I said that accounts are mine until the last breath that carries my name, and that any further request would be answered by people whose job is to say no, without apology. I lifted the doctor's letter next, the neat paragraph that said I knew where I was and who I was and how to protect the difference, and I told Emily that love would have meant waiting for a doctor to say what she wanted to declare in my hallway, and that since she could not wait, I'd put the question to professionals who neither owed me kindness nor owed her impatience. Robert reached then for the folder under my chair because he had a gambler's instinct and could smell the final card. But I set my foot on the cardboard and kept my voice even as I described the trust in words simple enough to cut, that the house and the savings no longer sat where a family quarrel could shake them loose, that a trustee with no use for our private battles would pay the bills and keep the heat flowing, and, when I was gone, follow instructions that named a scholarship in Linda's, name at the library she loved, and a donation to the church pantry, where she once stacked cans with a joy that shamed my stinginess, and that nowhere in those instructions did Emily's name appear, except in a sentence that said she was to be informed, and nowhere did Robert's name appear at all. Emily's mouth opened and closed twice before sound found it, and when it did, it came out soft and sharp at once as she asked if this was punishment, if I was casting her out like a stranger, if I remembered the nights she had sat with Linda through chemo years before the remission that had fooled us into thinking we had more time, and I felt the old kindness stir in me, and then sit back down because kindness had been used against me for too long. I did not count her sins or mine. I did not summon a ledger of failures or forgotten birthdays. I simply picked up the heating bill and handed it across the table with the pen that still remembered my grip. And I told her that she had spoken of winter as a finish line, and I had decided to treat it as a test, that the bill was paid and would be paid again and again by the name on that line until such time as breath and ink agreed to part, and that she was no longer to enter this house without my voice inviting her through the door. Robert began to speak of legal challenges and the right of a child to intervene when a parent was endangering himself, and I reminded him gently that sometimes the gravest danger arrives wearing a child's face, that sometimes the house is not on fire, and yet someone goes around telling neighbors to smell smoke so that they can sell the ashes, and the pastor, who had kept quiet out of decency, cleared his throat and said that a man has the right to bind his own future and to say no to those who think love is a synonym for control. Emily's eyes flashed the way they did when she was 12 and could not force the world to behave. And she stood so quickly, her chair scraped the floor, and she told me that I was choosing loneliness, that I would die alone out of stubborn pride, that no prayer or paper would change the fact that time always wins. I did not argue with time because I have learned its manners. I only stood as well, slower than I wanted, and I walked to the drawer where Linda used to keep envelopes for birthday cards, and pulled out the letter Benton had prepared, revoking keys and access and laying out the plain consequences of ignoring the line between family and trespass. And I handed it to Emily without dramatic flourish, while Mrs. Patel watched with eyes that were a mirror and a mercy, I said, that I hoped she would be kinder to herself than she had been to me, that the story could still bend if she wanted it to, that repentance is nothing like surrender, and everything like courage, and when she made a small movement as if to fling the paper back at me, I saw her change her mind and fold it instead. Because even in anger she respects edges when they are crisp and notarized. Robert asked whether I had planned all of this, whether the guests and the letters and the lock company van that pulled up outside just then were all pieces on a board, and I told him that in the same way one puts plastic over the windows before the real storms come. I had decided to make the house tight, and that the locksmith would be finished by the time the coffee cooled. They left without slamming the door, which is a kind of grace, and the pastor took my hand, the way a pastor does when words would only bruise, and Mrs. Patel carried dishes to the sink, as if she had done it every week of her life. And when the locksmith brought me the new keys, he did not look at my face too closely, which I appreciated, because I am a man who feels more than he shows, and I did not want him to see the relief shudder through me like a thaw. After they were gone, and the house had settled back into its nighttime noises, I sat again at the kitchen table with the heating bill in front of me, and I wrote the check slowly, not because my hand shook, but because I wanted to feel the weight of each stroke, the way Linda used to sign Christmas cards as if each loop were a promise. And I slid the paper into the blue envelope and addressed it with the care you give to letters that go out into the world and come back as warmth. I knew the winter was not over, and that there would be more tests than any man can plan for, but the battle that mattered had been fought in my own kitchen with witnesses and with gentleness, and I had chosen to be the author of my remaining days, which is all the victory an old man ever asks. The days that followed the confrontation felt strangely quiet, as though a storm had passed through and left the air cleaner, if colder than before. For the first time in years, I woke without waiting for a call that never came, without straining to hear a knock at the door that carried only disappointment. And in that silence I found a kind of peace I had almost forgotten existed. My new apartment became a refuge rather than a prison, and the lake outside my window seemed to change color with my moods. Gray when I brooded, gold when I felt the warmth of relief, black and still on the nights when I let memory wash over me. I filled the room slowly with new things, not grand or expensive, but mine. A chair that fit the curve of my back, a lamp that spread a gentle light in the evenings, a kettle that whistled cheerfully as if it knew I needed company. I placed Linda's photograph on the dresser, the same one I'd carried for decades, and each morning I greeted her softly, not as a man drowning in grief, but as one who carried love like a steady flame. Emily did not call again. There were no more letters, no sudden appearances, no shouted accusations in public places. I imagined her fury burning in some other part of the city. Imagined Robert feeding it with his bitterness. Imagined them telling anyone who would listen that I had betrayed them. But it no longer mattered. The cords had been cut. Whatever stories they spun, whatever venom they poured into the world, they could no longer touch me. Their absence, once a wound, was now a space in which I could breathe. Money no longer carried the taste of fear. The accounts were in order, the trust established, the bills paid without anyone questioning whether I was capable of writing a check. I could walk to the bank myself if I wished, and when I placed my signature on a withdrawal slip, the clerks addressed me by name, not as a confused old man, but as a client. A person whose identity was intact. Each statement that arrived in the mail felt less like numbers on the paper and more like evidence of survival. Proof that the winter had not beaten me, that my life was not a dwindling asset, but a present reality. I began to build small routines again. On Tuesdays, I walked to the park with a thermos of coffee and sat watching the children sled down the hill, their laughter rising into the frosty air. On Thursdays, I joined a group of retirees who gathered in the library to play chess, some sharper than others, all of us bound together by the quiet pleasure of competition without stakes. I was no master, but I relished the slow unfolding of each match. The click of a pawn moving forward, the long pause before a rook swept across the board. The others learned quickly that I was not a man fading into confusion, but someone still capable of focus, of strategy, of victory. And yet, for all the newfound peace, I carried with me the scars of betrayal, and I do not pretend otherwise. There are nights when I wake with the whisper still in my ears, "He won't last the winter." And the sting of those words has not dulled, though it no longer rules me. There are afternoons when I catch sight of a young woman in the street, hair caught by the wind, and for a heartbeat I see Emily as she once was, running across the yard with her mother's laughter behind her, and in that fleeting vision I feel both, the ache of loss and the fragile thread of forgiveness. I do not hate her, for hatred would tie me to her still, but I no longer love her as a daughter should be loved. What remains is something quieter, like a stone on the riverbed, worn smooth by time and sorrow. The final measure of justice came not in court rulings or bank statements, but in the simple fact of my endurance. Winter deepened. Snow rose in drifts along the roads. Ice crusted the edges of the lake, and still I walked each morning to the mailbox. Still I brewed my tea. Still I turned the pages of my books with steady hands. Each day that passed became an answer to the prophecy my daughter had spoken in a whisper she thought I would never hear. Each sunrise was my reply. I lasted. Now, when neighbors ask about my family, I tell them I have a daughter who lives her own life, and I leave it at that. There is no need to unspool the whole bitter story. No need to paint myself as a victim or her as a villain. What matters is that I claimed my life again, that I stood against the tide that would have swept me into silence, that I wrote the ending of my own story instead of letting someone else close the book. I do not know how many more winters are ahead of me. None of us ever do, but I know that when the time comes, it will not be because I surrendered to someone else's timetable. Not because a daughter decided her father's chapter had ended. It will be when my own body chooses, when breath gives way to stillness naturally, without interference or calculation. Until then, the furnace hums, the bills are paid, my name stands bold on every line, and each night I turn off the lamp in a home that is truly mine.